I'm Martha Feeney-Patton from the library, as many of you know, and thank you all for logging in today. This is our first online cultural lecture of the fall. We're excited to have you all here, and we're really happy to have Jason Giannetti here to speak on immigration in the U.S. He has a background of 17 years as an immigration attorney, but as many of you know, he also has a background as an academic scholar and lecturer on topics of religion, philosophy, and so you can really bring a historical perspective to everything. Today's talk is on the history of immigration law and policy in the U.S., and then he'll be speaking next week on immigration in the U.S. today in the past 4 years. And that will be a different Zoom link, so if you're planning to attend that, keep your eye on your email for the link for that one. We'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Friends of the Council on Aging for their support of these lectures. This fall we'll also have Dr. Gary Highlander speaking on the Cold War, and that one's going to be a pre-recorded lecture rather than a live Zoom lecture like this one. You can sign up through the library to receive the link to that when it's available. And then we'll also have a speaker we haven't had before, Sivan Etici, who is a pianist who will be doing talks on classical music inspired by jazz and on American music of the 20th century, and that'll be later in October. And we're really excited for those as well. So I will mention, while Jason's speaking, we are going to keep everyone muted, but at the end we'll have time for questions, or if you have questions during the lecture, you can also type them in the chat and we'll get to them when we have a chance for questions there. And this talk is also being recorded for the Minuteman Media Network cable. So if you don't want your video to appear in that, you can turn off your own video. There's a little icon of a video camera in the corner that you can click on to turn your video on and off. I think that is it. If you have any questions for me, you can also type them in the chat for me. But welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. And let's see if I can get Jason highlighted now.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. First of all, thank you for coming today. It's a beautiful day outside, a beautiful fall, autumn in New England. And this morning when I was getting ready for today's talk, I said to my partner, I'm doing this first Zoom lecture for the Carlisle Library. I've never done one before. And it's right in the middle of the day at 1:30. And she said to me, well, look on the bright side. You don't have all that travel time traveling out there and all that travel time traveling back. And I said, you know what? I really love driving out there, and I love going to the little coffee shop across the street and having my coffee and maybe a sandwich before the lecture. And I love seeing everybody in person in the crowded third floor of the library, and seeing people that I've seen for many years at the Carlisle Library. And I'm happy to be here, but I won't deny that there's a little bit of sadness that I'm not in Carlisle with you all together. And that's the reality of COVID today. And so we're going to make the best of this, okay? As you all know, I'm going to try to get the screen as best I can. My name is Jason Giannetti. I've given a number of lectures at the Carlisle Library and been sponsored by the Council on Aging, and I thank all of you for attending those lectures and having me back. I really appreciate it. Today, we are broadcasting live from my office in Brookline, Massachusetts. There's my little logo in the back. On my screen, it looks backwards. I don't know if how it appears on your screen, but anyhow. Today, unlike past lectures, we're going to be talking about a field that is actually a field that I practice in, which is immigration. I'm an immigration attorney, have been for the past 17 years. My office here in Brookline is for meeting with immigration clients, although since February, it's been a little bit quiet here since we're not meeting in person. We're doing everything through Zoom. But like I said, this is my first Zoom lecture, and I'm going to do my best. let me check in first. Can everybody hear me okay? Can everybody see everything okay? No problems. If there is a problem, feel free to put a little chat message up and let me know. I'll be happy to try to fix that.
Seems fine.
Good, thank you very much. Okay. I don't know if you got the outline of the 2 lectures. So we have a lecture today and we have a lecture a week from today at the same time at 1:30. Today is a brief historical overview of U.S. immigration law and policy. And at the end of it, we'll get into some of the current laws that people are dealing with today. And then I gave this lecture before, not at Carlisle, but at other libraries and at other community centers. And I've had to revamp everything. So part 2 is called Immigration in the Age of Trump, because things have gotten very different in the past 4 years. And I think that a lot of people probably have some burning questions about what's happening now, what's happened in the past 4 years, what this means for immigrants, what this means perhaps for you, and what the landscape is for immigration policy in America today and possibly going forward. So let's start off going pretty far back to 1790. In 1790, just 24 years after the American Revolution, we had our first census in the United States. And at that time, the census counted 3,227,000 people. Now we have to put a little footnote to that number. That number does not include Native Americans or, at the time, slaves, people who were forcibly brought here from Africa. All of those 3,227,000 were either immigrants or recent descendants of immigrants, mostly British and Dutch, who had come here during the colonial time. In 1783, US was first recognized as its own independent nation. And that's where immigration policy in the United States begins. In 1790, we have the first congressional acts that were creating our laws for who could be a US citizen. Prior to that, there were no laws about who constituted a US citizen. In that act of 1790 and some of the acts that followed thereafter, it required a 5-year residency. You had to live in the United States for at least 5 years before you could become a US citizen by law. In 1798, the political parties and those who were in political power changed hands. It went from the Federalist Party to the Republican Party, and it was the Republican Party who enacted that 5-year residency requirement. And after that, things remained relatively unchanged. There was a steady stream of immigrants, mostly coming from Europe, from that point through to around the 1840s. In the 1840s, things in Europe began to become less stable. As many of you probably know, in the 1840s, there was the potato famine in Ireland. And at the same time, there were a number of economic depressions that were happening, particularly in the German states. And there were also economic inspired revolutions that were happening also in many of the Germanic areas. And those revolutions led to upheaval, uncertainty. And so in the 1840s, there was a very large influx of immigrants from Ireland and from Germany. And most of those immigrants were Catholic. We have to keep in mind that at the time, the majority of immigrants from Europe in America prior to the 1840s were Protestant. And so a huge influx of Catholic European immigrants started coming in the 1840s, and this led to a anti-immigration or nationalist movement that happened by 1844. We have a party that calls itself the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party was officially known as the Native American Party, even though that name to us today sounds perhaps as a misnomer. They were not what we would call Native Americans. They were more nationalistic than Native American, but they called themselves the Know Nothing Party. And this was the origins of this Know Nothing Party is not exactly clear where they got this name from. Some claim that it was a secret society and that the members of the Know Nothing Party, if they were inquired about anything having to do with the party, they were to say that they know nothing. So there's some lore having to do with the name of this party. It was not only a secret society, but it was explicitly anti-Catholic. It viewed Catholic immigration as a challenge to what America was, a challenge to what America stood for, and it saw itself as trying to preserve the state of what it considered, quote unquote, Native Americans. I'm just going to read you a little bit about the Know Nothing Party. At its most vitriolic, nativism manifested itself in anti-Catholic riots against the Irish. In New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, there were violent riots. The Know Nothing Party, saw themselves as revealing the truth about Catholic nunneries, and they claimed that they were nothing but dens of iniquity and vice. And the Know Nothing Party, which was sort of a secret society, engaged in burning of convents and Catholic churches. And this was during the 1840s. So there was great vitriol that was felt by the political powers that saw themselves as upholding American tradition and what they might have even believed was American religion, over against the influx of immigrants who were Catholic from mostly Germany and from Ireland. This movement continued, but there was an abrupt end to it because of a major political and structural upheaval, which we call the Civil War. From 1861 to 1865, these other matters had to be put aside as America was engaged in civil war. When America came out of that war, there was huge industrial growth, and perhaps the most emblematic of that industrial growth was the expansion of the railroads in America. After 1865, railroads were being put down that would go from Boston to California and everywhere in between. In order to do this, since they didn't have the technological abilities that we have with tractors and backhoes and so forth, it took enormous physical labor to create these tracks from one shore to the other. And so during this time, we saw a huge influx of Chinese immigration. And many of the people coming in from China were coming in on the West Coast to San Francisco and LA, and they were being used for labor to expand our national railroad system. This came to an end around 1870 when the United States, after the railroad expansion was pretty much completed, there was a Great Depression in the United States, and there was, as a result, a backlash against these new immigrants, the Chinese immigrants who had come in. And we find that there were a number of people who had disparaging things to say about the Chinese who were coming in or who were already living here. For instance, in 1876, Scribner's magazine noted that, quote, "No matter how good a Chinaman may be, ladies never leave their children with them, especially little girls," close quote. There was a legislative committee that was put together to look into this matter, and that legislative committee concluded that, quote, "The Chinese are inferior to any race God ever made and have no souls to save, and if they have, they are not worth saving," close quote. So there is a lot of reaction, negative reaction, to the influx of immigrants who came to the United States to help it grow during this expansion period. And when that ended, we see this, this anti-immigrant sentiment being expressed. This led to our first explicitly racist law having to do with immigration, which was in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so this law, unlike any of the previous quote unquote immigration laws before it, was specifically aimed at keeping people from China out of the United States. This remained in place for the most part through to the end of World War I, and during the 1920s, when the United States was seeing a rise in Italian American immigration, Jewish immigration, and those Italians, of course, being Catholic, there was another strong reaction to those immigrants coming into the United States. And so in 1921, we see the very first act by Congress that has to do with origins. And so there's an Origin Quota Act that is put into place that says only so many people from these different places, and that would also include Jews who could be from any place, are allowed into the United States. These quota acts remained in place for most of the 20th century until 1965, when we have the first introduction of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA, which is the foundation of our modern system of immigration. So let's talk about that modern system of immigration. There's a number of ways that people can come into the United States today to be immigrants or to be visitors. And this goes back to that 1965 act, and it's been changed and altered in many ways over the years, but the bedrock of it remains mostly the same. There is immigration that's based upon family. In the modern rhetoric, this is often referred to as chain migration. But what it really means is if you have a relative who is a US citizen, that relative can sponsor you if you are one of very few select relations with that relative. And what are those select relations? If you are a parent of the US citizen, if you are a child of the US citizen, and if you are a sibling of the US citizen. Those are the categories that are included in the so-called chain migration. It's not very large at all. So it doesn't include grandparents, it doesn't include aunts, uncles, cousins, nephews, nieces. None of those people are included. And even within those few relations that I just spoke of, parent, child, or sibling, there are gradients of immigration. So a parent of a US citizen is what's considered an immediate relative, does not have to wait in line, can come in and become what we call a lawful permanent resident, LPR, more colloquially known as a green card holder, pretty much right away. A child, you would think that a child is an immediate relative, but not all children are considered by the law, the immigration law, to be immediate relatives. So if you are married, let's say you're 18 and you're married, you're no longer an immediate relative. Now you have to wait in line. There's a certain quota of people that fit that category, and they're set by Congress. And once they meet that quota, you have to continue to wait until your number comes up. So a child is a child for immigration purposes until he or she gets married, or if you are over 21, you're no longer considered a child. Well, what are you considered, you might ask? A son or a daughter. This is the way that the law speaks about it. A son or a daughter, not a child. A child is a child until they get married or turn 21. After that, they're a son or a daughter. And if they are a son or a daughter, they're no longer an immediate relative. And as a result, they have to wait in line. So parents are okay. Children, there's some caveats. Siblings automatically have to wait in line. They are not considered immediate relatives. You might think of your sister or your brother as an immediate relative to you, but that's not the way American immigration law looks at it. Your sister or your brother would probably have to wait in excess of 10 years before being able to adjust to lawful permanent resident or green card status. So within that family-based system, there's very few that qualify for immediate immigration benefits. So there's family-based, then there's work-based. Employment-based is another way of putting it. If you are from another country and there is a company here in the United States that says that they need your talents, then you might be able to get an immigration visa, meaning come here to live here permanently, through your employer. That sounds pretty simple. It's actually, in reality, much more difficult than it sounds. There's a number of reasons why it's difficult. First of all, from the employer's point of view, the law says that the employer has to certify that the immigrant who's coming here to work for the employer could not be found among US citizens or green card holders already in the United States. So if you own a restaurant and you want to hire your neighbor's son to be a waiter, and that son happens to live in Italy, you can't just say, hey, I'm going to sponsor this person. They're going to come, they're going to work for me. I'm going to pay them the going rate for waiting tables. No, you have to prove to the government that you couldn't just hire a US citizen or a green card holder who's already here to do that work. So the people who get these employment visas have to have some sort of specialty that makes them highly desirable to these companies, and that would allow these companies to honestly say, I can't find anybody who's a US citizen to do this work. In order to prove that, the company has to take out ads for somebody to do that work and show the government that they tried, they made a good faith effort to hire somebody from the United States, green card holder or citizen, to do that work. Even if we get that far, there's a few other hurdles, especially from the immigrant's point of view, to getting one of these work visas or employment visas. One of the hurdles is the law, in most cases, not all cases, says that the employer has to pay all the application fees and the legal fees. Not a lot of employers want to do that for just anybody or any person who doesn't have a specific skill. So the employer has to be highly motivated to do extra work and shell out extra money. The other thing that is difficult is that these employment-based visas are also limited in numbers set by Congress. And so every April 1st, which is when the applications open, lawyers like myself all over the country, all over the world even, submit the applications, and somehow, because there's way more applications than there are slots available, a computer basically does a lottery, and some of them get in and most of them don't. So you can have everything all lined up, and the odds are that you're not going to get it just because only so many slots are available. So work-based immigration is very difficult to achieve, even pre-2016. We'll talk about that next time. Another way for people to come here is what's often called the visa lottery. This was a law that was put into place by a Massachusetts senator, Edward Kennedy, which its actual name is the Visa Diversity System, and it's intended to create, quote unquote, diversity among the immigrants that come to the United States. And so it's a lottery that people in other countries can enter into. You don't have to have an employer, you don't have to have a relative, you can be just anybody. You can enter in, and the fees for entering in are pretty low, and the way to do it is pretty easy. And then once a year, certain names are taken out of a hat, so to speak, and those people can get green cards. It sounds pretty fair. It sounds like a good way to increase diversity, but there's a few caveats with this. For one thing, not every country is welcome to be part of the diversity lottery, the green card lottery. And for another thing, of the countries that are, there are certain numbers for some countries and other numbers for other countries. In other words, Ed Kennedy, being from, or his family hailing from Ireland, built into the law that the most number of applicants for the diversity lottery can be from Ireland. And other countries have fewer slots. So if you're from Ireland, your chances are greater than if you are from, let's say, Albania. So, but that is one way of coming into the United States, the diversity lottery or the visa lottery. The next one, we need to go back in time a little bit to talk about. The next one is through asylum or refugee. So I mentioned that after 1921, the laws for immigration didn't change very much, but after World War II, there was one major category that got created, and that is this notion of asylum or refugee status. This happened because, or at least in part, because of a political public relations ploy that Hitler did I believe it was in 1939, the SS St. Louis. There was a ship called the St. Louis, and on it were mostly Jews that were fleeing from Hitler's Germany. This boat was sent to many different countries, including Cuba and North America, Canada, United States, and everywhere it went, it was turned away. We don't want you. We have no way to incorporate you into our country. We don't have immigration laws that allow you here. You can't stay here. And so after traveling across the Atlantic, the boat turned around, went back to Germany, and I don't have the statistics on it, but as you can imagine, most of the Jews who were on that ship fleeing from Hitler's Germany perished in the Holocaust. After the horrors of World War II were known to the world, there was overwhelming feeling that this should never happen again. And in America, we created new laws that allowed for people to seek asylum or refuge in the United States if they are in danger in their home countries and have nowhere else to go. So this is a major change in US immigration law after World War II. And basically what it says, and then I've been using two words interchangeably, asylum and refugee. For the purposes of US immigration law, they're two separate things that only have to do with where you are when you apply for it. If you are already in the United States and you apply, you're considered an asylee. You're seeking asylum. If you are anywhere else in the world besides the United States and you apply for it, you're considered a refugee, or you're seeking refugee status. That's the only difference. Other than that, the application is pretty much the same. And what it says is that if in your home country, you are fearful that you will be put into prison, tortured, abused, possibly killed for one of a few distinct reasons, and I'll get into those in a minute, then you can apply to come to the United States to seek shelter from whatever it is you're fleeing from. So let's think about some of the categories that are included for this. One of the most obvious that it would make sense after World War II to create is political. If you fear for your life, if you think that you're going to be tortured or persecuted because of your political beliefs, then there's a way for you to come to the United States legally. If you are being persecuted because of your religion, then there's a way for you to come here, like the Jews fleeing from Hitler's Germany. Or, for instance, one of my first cases was back during the conflict in the Balkans. I had a client who was the child of a Muslim mother and a Serbian father. And the Muslim Croatian army wanted to recruit him, and the Serbian army wanted to recruit him, and he didn't want to fight for either. And so we were able to get him asylum here in the United States. So that has to do with religion. So politics, political viewpoint, religion. There's other categories that are included. And some of those would also have to do with sexual orientation. More recently, if you come from a country that practices female genital mutilation, you could get refugee or asylum status in the United States. So there's certain discrete categories of who can get this and on what basis. One of the big categories that I see in my practice that the law does not cover is general criminal activity. So the law is written so that the persecution that takes place needs to be at least done without the government interfering. I didn't say that very clearly. Let me rephrase it. The law was written so that it would protect from foreign governments persecuting individuals on the basis of their race or their religion or their political beliefs, etc. But not in every case does the government have to be involved. If the government, for instance, turns a blind eye to this sort of persecution, that might be enough to get asylum or refugee status in the United States. Let me give you an example. One of the cases, a difficult case that I had was a client from Central America was being pressured by gangs to run drugs for the gang. And the client didn't want to do that. The government, if the client went to the police or went to any other government official, there was a greater likelihood that the gangs would take vengeance on this person and that the police would do nothing. So the fact that the government doesn't protect this person from these gangs, that might be enough to get asylum or refugee status. But that's a tough call because as I just mentioned, the law does not protect from general criminal activity. If I had a client walk through the door today who says, I own a grocery store in Guatemala and we were robbed 3 times at gunpoint, and I'm just tired of it. I can't make a living there because of these gangs that are running around and are robbing us. I want to come to the United States. That's not going to be covered by asylum or refugee law. So it doesn't cover general criminal activity. It has to be done at least with the government in some way, either being a co-conspirator with it or turning a blind eye to whatever persecution happens. So let me go over those different categories that people can immigrate to the United States again. You have family-based, employment-based, the visa lottery, and then there's asylum or refugee. Those are the major ways that people are able to come to the United States to stay as an immigrant. In other words, immigrant intent means you don't plan on going to another country after you come here, at least not to live. You plan on living in the United States. There is another category that doesn't really fall into the immigrant category, but it was created by Congress, and it's called TPS, Temporary Protected Status. You may have heard about this because it's in the news a lot. So this was created to give people some legal way of staying here if some unforeseen event happened in their home country. So let's take the Fukushima disaster. After the earthquake and then the tsunami in Japan caused the nuclear reactor to let nuclear waste out. There were a number of tourists who were here from Japan, and at the time they couldn't go back to Japan immediately. Congress passed a law that said that they could stay here temporarily. It's called TPS for Japan. The idea about TPS is that it is temporary until whatever disaster happened is over and it's safe to return back home. The TPS for those Japanese who were here in the United States at that time is now expired. The idea is that they could and they should return back home. Similarly, you may recall that there was a Haitian earthquake. I don't recall what year it was. And after that earthquake, a TPS was created for people from Haiti, temporary protected status. Now, this status can be re-upped by Congress, and the Haitian government has lobbied Congress repeatedly to continue it. So even though the earthquake happened over 10 years ago, I forget exactly what year it was, TPS for people from Haiti still exists. We're going to talk next time about immigration law after Trump. The Trump administration is trying to end that. You may have heard about that. So TPS, although temporary, is another way that some people from certain countries stay here for an extended period of time. People from Haiti, for instance, could be here for 10 years or more on TPS. But it's not a path towards any permanent way of staying in the United States. Those are ways to immigrate here. There's a number of different categories for non-immigrant status. What does that mean? Well, you're probably familiar with people who come here to visit. Historically, it was called a B1, B2 visitor visa, or to come here to visit for pleasure or for business purposes. These would be granted regularly and pretty freely for people to come to the United States for doing business, for sightseeing, for visiting relatives, for whatever reason they had. They could come here on a B1, B2. A number of years ago, under President Obama, there was a change to the visitor visa, and we created what's called, in Europe, they call it an ESTA, and in the United States, it's called VWP, Visa Waiver Program. And this operates much like pre-boarding on a plane. You type in some information to a computer, you hit enter, and within a second, you find out if you can come or not. And it's basically a visitor visa, but there's certain strings that are attached that make it more difficult for anybody to overstay on the ESTA or the VWP visa. In addition to that, there's also a number of different temporary employment visas that people can come to the United States, work for a certain period of time, and then return to their home country. These kinds of visas are very popular, for instance, on Martha's Vineyard and on the Cape, where there's seasonal need for people to be working here. And so people come here from all over the world, work in the hotels, restaurants, etc., in these highly seasonal areas, and then return home. And it tends to work out very well for everybody. So there you have it. Very briefly, I'm leaving some time for questions because I imagine you might have a lot of questions. A very brief thumbnail overview of some 300 years of American history of immigration, and then a one-page outline of current ways that people come to the United States to immigrate here, and ways that people come here to visit. I don't know, Martha, how you go about fielding questions, but
Sure.
I'm happy to answer questions that people might have.
Great. So a couple things people sent to me in the chat. One was about the handouts, and we'll make sure we get that out to people after. And the other is about how many people legally immigrate to the US each year.
Okay, good question. I thought that we would get something like that, so I had my statistics. My statistics are a little bit old. Let me see here. Okay, immigrant visas. This was for 2010, but back in 2010 it was 482,052, and the numbers up through 2020, I believe, have not been too much higher than 500,000 immigrant visas a year.
Great, thanks. And I guess
Sure.
if other folks have questions, you're welcome at this point to unmute yourself and ask the question. The mute is the little microphone shape in the corner. Or if you're not able to do that, you can also type them in the chat.
Jason, I have a question.
Who's that?
My name's
That is
Jay.
Jay, yeah.
Okay, Jay?
Could you go back to the 1790s again, please? You said that a person had to prove they had lived in the United States for 5 years. I have two questions. One, were there any other criteria in addition to that, if you know? And two, what document did they have to show to prove they had been here for 5 years, given that, documentation wasn't so organized?
Great questions. Jay, despite how I look, I wasn't around then to be practicing immigration law. I'm not exactly sure what documents were used to show that you'd lived here for 5 years. And to the best of my knowledge, that was back in an act that was passed in 1795. That was all that they needed to show, was that they had lived here for 5 years. Later, I believe in, let's see, I think it was in the 1860s, there was an act that made one of the requirements a literacy requirement. We still have that. If you want to naturalize to be a US citizen, it's interesting. If you're not married to a US citizen spouse, then the rule is, for most categories, you have to have lived here 5 years, and for everybody, you have to pass a civics exam, is what they call it. So you have to get 7 out of 10 questions correct about US history, and I could ask you some of those questions, and I bet some of you would not get 7 out of 10. And you also have to be able to write a sentence that you hear in English and read a sentence in English. So that still exists today. That's in addition to all sorts of other requirements.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Jay.
I see a couple more questions in the chat here. One was, were women included as citizens in the 1790 census?
Yes, that did include women. And that's a great question that I should back up for, because it's going to be important next week. If you read your United States Constitution, which I expect you all will do, notice that the Constitution speaks about persons. Persons. I know it says all men are created equal, blah, blah, blah. That's men. But most of the time, the word that is used is persons, and it is not citizens. So there's an important legal question here, and that is, the United States Constitution covers everybody in the United States, not just citizens. It covers all persons. But in that census, yes, it was men and women. It did not include Native Americans. It did not include slaves at the time.
And another question there, more present day, is what needs to happen for the Dreamers to apply for and or receive citizenship?
We will get into this next week, but since the Dreamers, this is an act that happens pre-Trump, or actually I should put it this way, it's an act that didn't happen pre-Trump. Under Obama, President Obama tried to put forward the Dreamers Act, which was to allow people who were brought here as children by their parents. In other words, they didn't have a say in whether they entered illegally or not. The idea was that it would give these children the opportunity to get a path towards citizenship. That did not pass Congress, as you probably know. President Obama put through an executive order that did allow for what's called Daca, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this says that if you came into the United States between, and I should have this, I have it in my other office, I have it on a little chart, between certain years, and you're between certain ages, and you don't have a criminal background, then you can get this special protection called Daca, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which basically means you get a social security card number, you get work authorization, you can work here legally, you can stay here legally until and unless this is ended, because it's not a permanent thing. And you won't be deported as long as you remain in status, in this special Daca status. So that is what happened to it. We're going to talk next time, but the Trump administration has tried to throw that out. Even before Trump, there was a corollary to DACA, which was called DAP, Deferred Action for Parents, which was to apply to the parents of those people. And a judge in Texas said that procedurally it wasn't done properly, and it kind of died in Texas, so it never happened. Let's see, I see some questions.
Oh yeah, we've got a couple more there.
Yeah, if you could read them for me, that would be great.
Sure. So Helen asks, during the Civil War, does the historical record mention troubles due to prejudice between the Native Americans and Irish or German immigrants?
I wish I could say I don't know enough about that time period to really answer that question. I can take note of that and try to get back to you next week with an answer for that, but I don't know of you know, the historical record really changes focus once the Civil War starts. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's a good question.
And another question is, someone says, I heard on NPR that Trump wants to stop being born in the US, resulting in citizenship. Is that possible?
Thanks. That's a really good question, Marcia. That is not possible unless he changes or unless Congress changes the Constitution, because right now it is enshrined in the Constitution that anybody born on US soil is a US citizen, automatic. There are other laws that have, you know, the Constitution envisioned a lot of things, but there's always hard cases. So the question becomes, what if two US citizens are living in France and have a child together? What happens? There's laws that deal with that. And a person can fill out an application to become affirmed in their citizenship if they need to be. There's other ways of doing it, but that particular one, being born on US soil, automatically makes you a US citizen. That would take a constitutional override or an amendment to change it.
Well, that's a good
Any other questions?
Here. And yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves to ask questions as well.
Jason, this is Jay again. I'll just ask you a real quick question. I feel terrible about this, but I cannot join you next week. Is there a way I would be able to find a link that will have the recording from next week?
I believe that this is going to be recorded and that you should be able to see it.
Yes, I'll be able to send out that link after it's up and running. Yeah.
Thank you, Martha.
Thanks.
But you'll still be marked absent.
We don't keep a permanent record.
And
Anybody else?
Today's lecture will be recorded as well. I know my husband was not able to be here, and he'd really like to hear it.
It is, yes. So we'll, you know, I think we'll send out the links to everyone who was registered too, just in case anyone who was registered and wasn't able to make it.
Yes. And I'll just let everybody know, my email is Jason, Jason, at J as in John, G as in George, and then Esquire spelled out, ESQUIRE.com. Jason at jgesquire.com. If you have a question for me that I didn't answer, or if you want to tell me that I shouldn't wear a dark shirt next time, I should wear a light shirt. If you have any comments, just let me know. Send me an email, and I will try to be prepared with that for next time.
Can you give your email address one last time, please?
Sure. It's Jason, Jason, at jgesquire.com. And Esquire is spelled out, ESQUIRE.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes,
Great.
questions? All right.
And I would really look forward to those emails because, like I said, I changed this lecture around from what it used to be because life is so different now, you might say. My life is very different. And if there are burning questions that people have, that will help me to shape what next week's class will look like.
Thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah. It's good to see everyone, and I hope we see you next week.
I hope
And
so.
thanks again to the Friends of the Library and the Friends of the Council on Aging for their support. Have a great week,
Yes.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody. I will
Thank
see you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.